My next guest is probably the most read, I was going to say columnist, reporter. He calls himself an investigative reporter in this country. He's in over 950 newspapers nationwide. He holds a Pulitzer Prize. And as a way of introduction, I'm going to read some words, and then I'll tell you where they came from. At its simplest and purest, a muckraker is a person who rakes manure. The one commodity that in this era of food, fuel, and financial shortages is always in plentiful supply in Washington. I rake through the vast droppings of politicians and bureaucrats every day looking for the undigested evidence of their gluttony. While others may scorn what I do, I find it particularly satisfying. Those are the words of our next guest, Mr. Jack Anderson. Welcome. I thought that would be a pretty good introduction to read. I think this was some Argosy and a piece you had written. That word, muckraker, to tell you the truth, I was not sure. I had a connotation, I guess, like a lot of people. It sounds like an odious sounding type of thing that somebody does, but you...
It's what Teddy Roosevelt called the investigative reporters.
Was that the first use of...
I don't mind it because we're finding out there's an awful lot of muck to rake, and I think it's best to get it out in the open. I think sunlight's the best disinfectant.
I was reading a paperback of your book, the Anderson Papers, and I found it absolutely fascinating, and especially with what is going on lately. We got so many areas, I hardly know where to start. What are you involved in currently? Have we seen the last of, well, we haven't seen the last of Watergate, but do you think there are more things to come, more bombshells, as they were using the term several months ago, or has it pretty well been unearthed and now we're just waiting for
We're looking into more things. I think that this $100,000 from Howard Hughes could explode into a major bombshell. Mm-hmm. It's an old story. I dug it up back in 1971. But it's taken on some new connotations.
This was the money that was supposed to have been held by Mr. Rebozo in a safety deposit box for 3 years and returned untouched and so
Howard
forth.
Hughes thought he was donating it to Richard Nixon, and it was delivered in two $50,000 bundles to the president's estates, one at San Clemente, the other at Key Biscayne, and it was turned over to the man his closest confidant. Now, that's B.B. Rebozo. And B.B. Rebozo said, he just stuck it into a safe deposit box and didn't look at it. It gathered dust instead of interest for 3 years. And this is a man who sees the president every weekend. Mm-hmm. He's his president's constant shadow. And he would have us believe that he didn't even mention this to the president. Now, the president had already been burned a couple of times by Howard Hughes back in the 1960 and 1962 elections over a $205,000 loan. Obviously, Howard Hughes was bad political medicine, and yet B.B. Rebozo for 3 years didn't mention it. Well, my sources had told me that B.B. Rebozo not only had mentioned it, but that the president had invited him to spread the loot around and give some to Rosemary Woods, his secretary, to his brothers, Donald and Ed.
Now, this has not been proved yet, has it? Or is this it's been suggested that is what may have happened?
This is what I was told by a White House source. Mm-hmm. And I couldn't prove it. Because I couldn't prove it, I went to the Senate investigators and said, here's some questions. Why don't you ask them? Here are the people to call in. Mm-hmm. I said, when B.B. Rebozo... When we broke the story about the $100,000, the Internal Revenue Service came in and began looking into his into the gift and what he did with it, and he got worried. And he went to the president, and the president said, "Go talk to Herb Kalmbach, my attorney." I said, "Now why don't you try to find out whether Herb Kalmbach will discuss this?" So Terry Lensner, he's a crack investigator for the Senate Watergate Committee. First of all, very shrewdly, he brought in B.B. Rebozo because there's a problem about attorney-client privilege. So he brought in B.B. Rebozo, and he said, he asked Rebozo whether or not he had discussed this $100,000, whether he distributed it. B.B. Rebozo said no, under oath. Asked him whether or not he had discussed distributing it with anyone. B.B. Rebozo said no. Asked him whether he had spoken specifically to Herbert Kalmbach. B.B. Rebozo denied it. Said, well, did you consult him as an attorney? No, said B.B. Rebozo. Mm-hmm. Did you have an attorney-client privilege? Again, he said no. Then they brought in Kalmbach behind closed doors. And they asked Kalmbach, did Bibi Rebozo discuss this $100,000 with you? Kalmbach said, yes, he did. Would you relate to us that discussion? I cannot because of attorney-client privilege. And then old Sam Irvin brought out the testimony. Says, you don't have any attorney-client privilege.
It's already been breached, you mean?
We have the sworn testimony of the man you claim was the client. And he says that he didn't consult you and that you have no attorney-client privilege. So Kalmbach was stuck, and Kalmbach had to testify, and he testified that Bibi Rebozo did come to him and did tell him that he had distributed the money to Rosemary Woods and to Dawn and Ed Nixon.
So now you come to that terrible thing. You've got two stories that are in complete dichotomy, and you have to figure out who's telling the truth.
Right, and if the president had knowledge of it, this could be a major bombshell. It means that there was a slush fund that the president had something to do with distributing. They asked Kalmbach in some detail what he did. He said, well, he wasn't a tax attorney. When Bibi Rebozo had asked him about it, so he told Rebozo that he would speak to a tax attorney. And they asked him, did he do it? Yes, that same day. Well, they've checked. They found out on that day he did speak to a tax attorney. He did not give the tax attorney the names of the clients, but he did tell the tax attorney the story.
You mentioned your sources a moment ago, and that's been a constant source of irritation to the White House and Washington as to how you manage to get this information, and almost sometimes even before it's been released. And I know you're not at liberty, but how do you contact people to get information, Jack? I mean, are they within the... Obviously, some of them have to be on rather high to the top from some of the evidence and papers and things on, especially on the Pakistan-India relation fiasco of some years ago.
Well, we use a different method, I think, than most. The FBI has paid informants. I don't like paid informants. They tend to tell you what you want to hear because you're paying them. The FBI's had some disasters because they relied on paid informants. These paid informants couldn't back up their stories in court. So I don't use paid informants. And I don't use disgruntled people. I don't want people to tell me stories because they hate their superior, because they dislike their work, because they're not reliable.
You think that these people give you the information because they're genuinely concerned that things are happening that they feel, in the case at least of Daniel Ellsberg, seemed to think morally that this was wrong and made a decision that come what may, I'm going to lay this out.
Yeah, they're the best. I want to get people who still believe in the country. I want to get people who also believe and understand that the country belongs to the people. This country doesn't belong to Richard Nixon. This country belongs to the people. And those who work in the White House are working for us. They're not working for Richard Nixon. And I've managed to persuade one or two of that. And I've managed to persuade a couple of them that their first loyalty is to the people who are paying their salaries. And that when you get wrongdoing, when you get hypocrisy, when you get misrepresentation, when they lie and they cheat, when crimes are committed, that we have the right to know about it.
You had an interesting prologue, I think it was, to the book on power in itself. And I guess the old cliche is that power corrupts, which is not entirely true. It's the abuse, I suppose, of power that really corrupts. You said something happens to people, and I suppose it's not only in politics, is it? I suppose it's a head of a corporation, possibly even an entertainer who gets in a certain position. There comes with that a certain power and a certain ability to influence people. But you say very often some people can handle it, and other people don't handle power well. But that's the reason that they want to get in political life is the use of that power. And then it tends to change them. You find that as pretty much of a standard. Does it also happen to journalists now?
I think
you're in a powerful position yourself, and sometimes that being able to influence people, I suppose you have to draw certain guidelines and say, I wonder if I should put this in the column. I wonder if I should say this. You have to make a lot of decisions, I would guess, do you not?
The name of the game in Washington is power, and people will do for power what they wouldn't do for money. And the struggle over power is intense. It's in Washington, it's a sophisticated struggle. I'm a newsman operates in the open, and everything he does is out where everybody can see it. The great danger are those who operate behind closed doors. those who operate in secret. Now, the president never ever expected that his secret conversations were going to be draped out for the world to see. Now we know. We know how they talk. We know how they think.
Do you find, like I think Senator Scott said today, he found it disgusting, shabby, and immoral with all parties concerned? I think those were his words. And he was has been quite a booster up until now of the president. But
I think it's absolutely sleazy. I have never read anything quite like it. I've read over half, almost 2/3 of the transcripts so far. We're trying to wade through them. I have yet to find one place where they say, what's proper? What's morally right? What's decent? What's best for America? I haven't found one place.
That seems to be the greatest criticism from both Democrats and Republicans. It's not a particularly partisan thing there, that nobody seems to say at any time. The word moral indignation has been raised time and time again. That says, hey, there's something's wrong here. We're not concerned about what's happening. We're only concerned about keeping this thing contained so someone doesn't get hurt.
And I've read, the president himself started off by saying this exonerates him. Now, I've read it. I think that I understand English. I'm supposed to be a professional with words. It doesn't exonerate him. It's against the law to cover up a crime. It's against the law to pay a bribe to silence defendants in an investigation. It's also against the law to order this. Well,
and it is in the transcripts, is it not?
On March 21st, John Dean reported to the president that bribes were being paid, that E. Howard Hunt, the Watergate conspirator, was demanding another $120,000.
And $75,000 was delivered as of that date, wasn't
They
it?
discussed it. The president wanted to know how much he thought it would cost in the end. John Dean said it may go as high as $1 million. The president said, well, I can get that. We can get that cash. But how will we handle it? Who ought to handle it? John Dean said, well, John Mitchell would be a good one to handle it. The president agreed. Then they went on here. I took the trouble because I wanted to get it right. Now, I understand English. Let me read what it says.
This is not out of context.
This is not out of context. They were discussing this thing. Now, what does this mean? The president said to John Dean, you have no choice but to come up with the $120,000 or whatever it is, right? Dean replied, that's right. The president said, would you agree that that's the prime thing, that you damn well better get that done? Dean said, obviously. Hunt ought to be given some signal anyway. The president said, expletive deleted, get it. Now, what does that mean? Now, to me, that means that the president told him to do it. Told him to go ahead and pay the bribe. Now, that's what it means to me. And we have the president saying it doesn't mean that? Well, now, this is what it means to me, and this is obviously what it meant to H.R. Haldeman, who was listening and who, right after this conversation, went out and made a call to John Mitchell, the one who had been suggested.
Right.
Then John Mitchell called Fred LaRue. Fred LaRue had in his apartment $350,000 in $150 and $20 bills. Just happened to have them there, laying around with the lettuce, and they...
Jack, let me interrupt just so we don't get too far behind. We'll come right back. Just a couple of minutes and we'll be right back. We're talking with Jack Anderson, if you just joined us, and we were just talking to each other during the commercial break here that the public has almost become immune or inured, or as these revelations come up, they become numbed all the time. And you hear very often people say, well, this is the way it works. When this whole Watergate thing opened up, they said, well, all administrations are guilty. President Johnson did this. President Truman did this. Eisenhower did so-and-so. Even President Kennedy. They all had things that went on, and this is the way the system works. And that's kind of sad to hear that this is the way it works, and everybody accepts it as such. You don't really believe that it has to work, or politics has to be this way, does it?
Well, not only... It doesn't have to be this way, but it's not this way. This is going to sound strange coming from me, but I have great respect for professional politicians. And I think when we look at a professional politician, We ought not to see H.R. Haldeman and John Ehrlichman. We ought to see an Elliot Richardson or a Bill Ruckelshaus. This is not the way past presidents have done. It's been my peculiar function to sort of cover the shady side of the street.
Mm-hmm.
And of all the presidents that I've covered in the past quarter of a century, Richard Nixon kept his cards closest to his vest, kept his doors locked the tightest, kept his blind down.
That animosity toward the press goes back a long way, does it not? This is one of the things that I didn't mean to interrupt you, but I've seen so many newsmen say that the reason they seem to maybe pick on him sometimes is because there's obviously such an open hostility between the press and President Nixon, and it has been going on since he first ran for office in California, that he has an innate dislike or distrust of the press, and I think that probably pushes newsmen sometimes maybe to be a little more unkind than they might normally be. Isn't that true? Because if you like somebody in office or...
Well, when you read the White House transcripts, he hated just about everybody. There were a couple of places where he said, no one's for us, and he almost paranoid. Anybody who said anything against him, anybody who did anything against him, rivals, critics were suddenly enemies.
Mm-hmm.
And we had him saying that, well, we're going to use the FBI, we're going to use the CIA, we're going to get back at these people who've done things to us. Now, past presidents just didn't operate that way. You'd get a scandal. I think that we had better access to information in the Truman White House, the Eisenhower White House, the Johnson, Kennedy White Houses than we do now, and we found poor old Harry Vaughn gave a deep freeze to Bess Truman, and that used to be a big scandal.
What, didn't Eisenhower fire Sherman Adams when he got a Vicuna coat?
We dug that story out,
right.
A Vicuna coat, and that was big news in that time. Lyndon Johnson had his Bobby Baker, but Richard Nixon, over 24 of his closest associates, of his most trusted aides, the people that he brought in have already either pleaded guilty to crime, and many of them have, about a dozen of them, or they have been indicted for crime. Now, sure, Lyndon Johnson had his Bobby Baker, and Dwight Eisenhower had his Sherman Adams, and even Jesus Christ had his Judas, but not all 12 apostles.
We will be accused, when I say we, collectively, you've already been accused, but I will probably be accused by people now of being the Eastern liberal establishment, and I have made jokes about what is happening. I hope not unfairly, but just trying to make humor about what has happened. But that is considered, when you do that, almost un-American. Do you think we tend to place our politicians and the president on down so much in awe that we lose sight of the fact that they're a mortal man who is elected to do a job, and he's as human and has as many frailties as anybody else, but we set them almost apart so that any condemnation of the president or a senator is tantamount to heresy or something, and people go at you and say, how dare you attack the presidency? Well, the presidency is always going to be there.
That's true. Well, we have built up the president over the past 200 years. He's become our father figure. He's become our only royalty. He's our commander-in-chief, and we've built him up. A myth has grown around the office that whoever the president is, however dubious his past, however poor his qualifications, that when he steps into the White House and when he takes his seat in the Oval Office, that magically, in some way, somehow, he sheds his past and he takes on the mantle of statesmanship, and that the office ennobles him. Well, I think the office... I think it ennobled Harry Truman. I rather saw him grow in the office.
Mm-hmm.
And I think he was a good president. And he came from rather dubious background. And I remember seeing an old man one day shuffling along in front of the White House. He was head bent with age. He was on a creaky walking on a creaky cane. And he happened to hit the gate just as the president came in his limousine. The old man recognized him. And recognizing the president, he took off his hat and with that old head bowed, put it over his heart. And I never saw a limousine stop so fast. Screech of brakes, shift into reverse. President of the United States piled out of the back seat, threw an arm around that old man, visited with him. Harry Truman never did forget that he came from the people, that he was a servant of the people, not their masters, but their servant. I think he was ennobled by the presidency. Now, I hate to report this. Believe me, I hate to report it. I wish the Watergate had never happened. I wished I'd never had to write it. I get no joy in writing it. But it is my duty to report, and I can do nothing else. I must report. Richard Nixon has not been ennobled by the presidency. He has degraded the presidency, and that's a fact.
Jack, I want to ask you one other question before we bring out our next guest. When Leon Jaworski was appointed as special prosecutor, that was with the blessing, was it not, of the White House, his man, and he was given carte blanche, as I understand it at that time, if I remember, whatever Mr. Jaworski needs to bring this investigation, whether it's the materials that would be furnished, and it would be a hands-off policy.
He was recommended by John Connolly. John Connolly was the one that persuaded the president to hire him.
And he was going to have an absolutely free hand. And now I understand that there will be no more material given to him. Now, isn't that some kind of a breach in an agreement?
It's a breach, and I think the public just is going to have to draw the obvious conclusion. What we now have, the White House transcripts that we now have, are the best of Nixon. Those are the things that he's voluntarily given.
The edited...
This is the best side of his case. The things that he hasn't given us yet, the things that he's withholding, the things that he's refusing to give to his own special prosecutor, that he's refusing to give to a House Judiciary Committee, I'm almost afraid to read them.
Do you think the often word use of executive privilege and national security has been rather loosely interpreted
Well,
in many of these things?
You don't find those words in the Constitution. You don't find words about all the president's perquisites and privileges. You don't find executive privilege mentioned in the Constitution. You find words in the Constitution like freedom, liberty, tranquility, the general welfare. You see, our founding fathers wrote the Constitution to protect the people from the government. The Constitution wasn't written to protect Richard Nixon from the people. It was written to protect the people from Richard Nixon.
I'm going to bring out a young lady, not to end this discussion, but only to end it so we're not accused of loading the show on one side. But it is true when you talk about the press. The press should it not have an adversary position as far as government's concerned? That has always been the idea of the press. It is an adversary of the...
Yeah, people don't have to believe us. No one has to believe us. But under our system, in a free country, the press is supposed to provide an alternate source of information, a rival version of events.
You do not have to choose to believe it.
And the president isn't being silenced. He can go on anytime he wishes, to speak as long as he wishes on all three networks, during prime time, without commercial interruption. He can say anything he wishes. Nobody's shutting the president up.
Speaking
and
of...
you got your choice. If you want to believe Ron Ziegler's version of Watergate, you're welcome to do it.
Speaking of commercial interruptions, Jack, cleverly you led me into this. We'll take this brief pause for a commercial interruption. Then we'll be back. Now to present the administration side. No, that's not fair to her. She's a lovely young actress. She'd been with us before. She played the daughter in the movie Joe and young Zelda in television's Last of the Bells. Would you welcome Susan Sarandon? Susan? I didn't mean to imply that you were politically going to get involved in any of this at all, although you may have some views on what's happening.
I just wrote him a letter.
You just wrote who a letter?
Mr. Nixon.
Do you really sit down and write letters?
I have to, because it has to balance... I mean, I'm sure he doesn't read them, but someone reads them. I send him telegrams. I write him more than my relatives.
Oh, may I ask in what
I just told
manner
him
you wrote him?
I didn't believe him anymore, although I never did, but I thought it would sound better if he thought that I had believed him.
I thought you were going to balance this out for us.
And then I said that impeachment wasn't, it was a safety structure of the Constitution, certainly not a threat to the democracy, and that even if he was innocent and had an uncanny amount of bad luck in surrounding himself with all these dishonest men, that he should put his ego aside and think of the good of the country. and resigned.
Well, that certainly balances out Jack's side. I have a strange feeling I'm going to get a call from Ron Ziegler right after this show is over. I don't know why. Would you like to get on? So what have you been doing lately? We'll talk about what's been happening with you.
I've been working, and I've been robbed, and my house was hit by lightning. My cat died.
You want to take those one at a time? We thought the country was in trouble. Now, you got ripped off?
Yes, I was staying at a hotel here. I came out to do some...
Don't mention the hotel.
No, I won't mention the name. But during the night, someone came into my very room and stole a large satchel that had everything I need to live. I was planning to move the next day into an apartment.
You were in the same room when they came in?
Yes, it was at the foot of my bed, and much to my surprise, in the morning when I woke up, it was gone. All my cash, my traveler's checks, my tarot cards, my kazoo, my penknife, everything I need.
Your tarot cards?
Yes, was gone.
Aren't those fortune-telling
That's right.
tarot cards?
And so I reported it.
Didn't the cards tell you were going to be robbed that night?
And I was very irate.
If you'd have looked at those cards earlier, you wouldn't have been there.
I had done them the night before, and in fact, they had said something, the tower shows up, you know, that's something that means a very big event. I, of course, assumed that it would be something wonderful. Goes to show.
So you got robbed.
I got robbed. The police were very sweet, very Hollywood, just like on The Rookies, very cute, came in.
Are they like that, like in television?
They were gorgeous. They were real funny. They call me up from time to time, tell me that they haven't found anything.
Do they? Do they really? But they're still working on the case.
Yes.
But I don't imagine they have much...
No, they said I was actually very lucky because there'd been 40 rapes and 5 murders in that area within the last few months, and that I was lucky that I didn't wake up. And one other time someone was in my room and I woke up. I was in Germany doing a show, and I woke up. Of course, I was a few years younger.
Mm-hmm.
And I woke up and there was a man standing over my bed, and I said, "Can I help you?" So there's no telling what I would
Pretty brilliant right there.
I don't handle myself really well in those kinds of
Well, come to think of it, that is really not too bad. What would one say at that particular moment?
I don't know. I guess it's just my training, you know, being very polite. And he just cracked up and backed out of the room.
Can I be of any help? And he left.
No, I just said, "Can I help you?" It was the only thing that I...
That's the famous laughing burglar. And he Now, what else happened? You got robbed? And
well, my house was hit by lightning and my cat died. But then I kind of...
Was your cat killed by lightning, you say?
No, by a car.
Oh.
But then...
Sorry.
I had a good week after that.
Now for the good news.
Well, just everything went pretty calmly, you know. And then, so I thought I would try to drive in California, which I have never done, and indeed shouldn't. But...
Why do you say that?
Because I have a fear, an irrational fear of getting on a freeway and never getting off. And not...
You mean growing old there and raising a family?
And not even knowing till I hit, like, Pennsylvania that I've made it, you know, that I'm in the wrong direction, because I have no concept of where anything is. There's no downtown. Everything's like a big subway and city kind of combined. So I thought if I stay on Santa Monica, because that's near my street, everything will be cool, and I'll just maybe take a little drive off to the side. So I did it, and I was really fine. And on the way back, I was right near my street. I slowed down for a light. I was near a bus stop. A woman ran over, jumped in my car, crying, knocked on the window, jumped in my car, sat down and said, "I'm having a heart attack. Take me to the UCLA outpatient clinic." Well, I have no idea where anything is if it's off of Santa Monica. And I said, "Are you really sure?" She said, "Oh, yeah." She was very upset. She was crying, and she said, I have to get there because it closes at 4:30, and I've only brought my eye drops and not my anal nitrate or whatever it is." And I said, "Right, well, that's a problem. Let's try to find it."
Right.
So we started driving, and as she found out that I didn't know where I was going, she calmed down and said, "Well, you can maybe just leave me at Wilshire, you know." And I found out the crazy part was that after I talked to her for a while and she kind of stopped sweating and was more together, she turns out to be a child star from the movies, and she went into her whole rap about how she had a career till she was 11, and then her chest developed too fast, and it ruined her career because she still looked real tiny, but they couldn't pass her off for 7 anymore. And she said, "God bless you," and said, "Just leave me at the bus stop," and got out. And there I was. By that time, I had gotten up Wilshire somewhere. And I asked a policeman, and he got me back onto Santa Monica.
That's one of the weirdest weeks I've ever heard of in my life.
Well, it's very much like
your
being...
Your cat died, and...
Yeah, but it's like being in New York. It made me feel more at home.
You drive anymore now, or have you...
No.
You past that?
Yeah.
Let me interrupt you for a moment, and we'll be back. Here's Ed to discuss one of the problems of the American family. Just one of them. We're back. We're talking with Susan Sarandon. Mr. Jack Anderson's been our guest. This picture you just finished, was it Waldo Pepper? Was that the name of it?
Yes, yes.
Somebody said you did your own stunts in this?
Well, I did some of them.
What'd you have to do?
Well, I got out of a plane, an old plane in the air, but then I had to fall off and be killed, and we didn't actually do that.
I hope not.
But I had to walk out on the wing, and then when we
You did that yourself?
Well, I did it on the rig. There,
Yeah.
When we went to Florida to do the final things with George, very nicely saved till the last, I had to walk out of the plane on the wing, and the plane was on a rig, which was on a truck, which was going fairly fast, but there's also a wind machine that was going about 100 miles per hour. And the whole idea is that they
Sounds like the old barnstorming days.
It's exactly what the movie's about. And they had talked me into doing this particular stunt because they needed some sex, so the idea was that I would go out and they would shred my clothes, and my clothes would blow off, and I'd be there in this little slip. Well, indeed, the clothes did blow off, including my slip, which was up around my neck.
And they got what they wanted.
Movie. Well, maybe for some out footage, but I don't know if they could.
What kind of a rating does this have?
Well, hopefully it's going to be a, what do they call it? A good rating, a family
I don't know what
rating.
they mean anymore.
Well, they
Parental guidance.
That means it can have lots of violence, but no sex.
See, I don't understand that whole business.
I don't either.
You know, you think a young child would be less affected by sex or violence in a film?
No, but obviously their parents are.
Yeah, I think that's the problem. You know, what else you been doing out here?
Well, I came back out to do Front Page.
That's the one where you're doing with Jack Lemmon?
Yes.
And Billy Wilder's directing it?
Directing it, he sure is.
That's been done, that's a remake of a very famous
I
play
understand
originally.
once, yes, of a play, and I think they did a movie once, but they changed one of the men's parts to a woman's part or something. My part is actually rewritten. She was kind of dull, and now she plays the organ and sings in a movie house for Follow the Bouncing Ball, which was quite interesting because I don't sing or play anything but the kazoo. So they had to kind of fake all that. And I sing Button Up Your Overcoat. That gives Walter Matthau the idea to tell me that Jack Lemmon has been exposing himself, wearing nothing but a raincoat, to young girls in a museum, see, to try to break up
Was that
our
the
marriage.
original story? That's been updated, hasn't it, a little bit? Jack Lemmon plays an exhibitionist?
No. That's just a story that they tell. To try to
Oh, I
break
see.
it up.
I see. I
It's
thought
all make-believe. This is the mad, mad world of make-believe.
I see. You fooled me there for a moment.
Oh, I'm sorry.
Where'd you get this? I just wondered.
Oh, a friend sent me this flower. Sent me a plant for going on the show.
Do you talk to your plants? Have you read that book?
Yes.
Where that if you talk to your plants, they'll grow healthier?
That's true. You should hug your trees, too.
Hug your trees. And fondle your bushes, I suppose. Anything that will make them... Anything that will help.
Whatever turns you.
Whatever works. Absolutely. On that rather eclectic note, we'll take a short break, and we will be right back. Jack, in the brief time we have left, what do you think will happen, if you can say in 30 seconds? Do you think there will be an impeachment? And if there is an impeachment voted, how do you think it will turn out?
Well, Speaker Carl Albert told me that he thought that about July 15th there'd be a vote. He says he's not sure what it'll be. I think we're on the road to impeachment, and I think the president will be impeached.
Thank you. I guess we'll have to wait later in the summer to find out what's happened. Thank you for being with us here.
Thank you.
Thank you, Jack. Tomorrow night, Jack Palance, Joanna Cassidy, Jose Molina, and our good friend Orson Bean will be with us. Thank you. Good night.
I'm humbled by that applause.